Okay, take one. Hi folks, welcome. Mr. Deep here again, and welcome to another session. Today I want to talk about how we are influenced. Now there's a Russian writer, Mouravieff. I've referenced him several times in my other videos. His book series is Gnosis 1, 2 and 3. I encourage you to check out that information. So basically what he talks about is that man is influenced in three ways: A, B and C influences, and I want to discuss them today, and I want to add an extra influence which I've become aware of, and it's important for you guys to be aware of as well. But let's start at the beginning. We have the A influence. Now basically you could say many things, but all of the A influences essentially, they're all of the influences in the world that keep a man or a woman asleep or locked in this matrix frequency prison. A influences, you could call them worldly influences, and generally they are the influences that are very similar to our values, our goals, our worldly goals, our vanity, and generally they're the things that entice us but ultimately don't give us, as Mick Jagger would say, I can't get any satisfaction. They're essentially the world of the A influences. Now, there are what's called B influences. B influences I would call divine influences. So these are influences around you that ultimately lead you to liberation or overcoming the matrix or waking up. And generally speaking, those who are heavily under the A influence regard the B influence in a negative way, and this is because the B influences essentially challenge that A influence world that you live in, and they also threaten a sort of collapse of the worldly man of A influence. And at the end of the day, the reason the fragility, the insecurity about these B influences from the A influence man is essentially because his house is more of a tent. It's built on sand, it's very fragile, and the other thing is it takes tremendous effort to kind of keep it afloat, to keep it from falling apart, even on its own, without the B influences. Whereas the B influences, you could say, is once you accept and allow yourself to be influenced and follow that path, they will essentially lead you to a possible collapse, but in order that you build something more authentic on top of such a shaky A influence life. And the other thing is, even though it's not first seen this way, a true B influence, a true divine influence, is essentially a love. And it seeks what's best for you. And it's kind of like Brussels sprouts. For the man in the world, the man full of A influences and governed by the A influences, it can at first seem unpleasant, but if responded to and accepted, it can lead to a lot of spiritual nutrition. What I do notice, though, is man tends to cling to A influence all his life, unfortunately, despite the suffering that's involved. In regards to the B influences, they tend to generate a collapse or a crisis, but that's in order that you can align with the B influence. Now, this step from the A to the B influences and the awakening process, or liberating from the matrix, is, it's a complicated topic, but I'm just going to touch on a few things in regards to the steps from the A to the B influence. So in accepting the B influence, you generally accept a collapse or interpret a crisis in terms of what it's attempting to teach you in terms of raising your level of consciousness and your actual development. And it also can lead to a realization that B influences are there to help you to develop, to help you to be free, to be happy, to be joyful, etc. With increasing B influence, also what occurs is a man learns to stop lying to himself. One also needs to heal the emotional center. This is also part of the B influence, because without the healed emotional center, there is no true, authentic spiritual development. Also part of the process is great self-honesty, and that's self-honesty comes about by true self-observation and seeing the contradictory nature. I mean, we all have a story and we all believe our story, but to really develop spiritually, one needs to really see the lies that they tell themselves. And this can also be a result of the very fact that when it comes to a emotional block, when it comes to the unconsciousness of the man, in which a lot of trauma is kind of locked in there, there is essentially a lot of dishonesty as a result of that. But that dishonesty to the man deceived will seem very honest and truthful. The other thing to notice with these steps is generally a man under world influence is a man that is a contradictory man, in the sense that there's many eyes. You could say Legion self. 1 minute he's one thing, and then the master is replaced by another master. Legion self is the best way to describe it. But what that all leads to is essentially, if a man looks closely, is a man without genuine will. It's an imagined will, which is really ultimately a man that's at the mercy of the forces, the world, the A influences that keep him trapped in his predicament. And in regards to the unconscious as well, is that when that's not conscious, one tends to be possessed by the things that lurk within the unconscious. Another part of this process is developing a magnetic center. So as you respond to B influences and accept the crisis collapse and interpret it correctly, you begin to, at first it's a very delicate magnetic center. As this magnetic center builds, it actually starts, the polarity changes, and it starts to align more so with the divine, with more B influences. And what happens with that is that you will notice an increased synchronicity. In other words, more events and coincidences take place to keep you moving on that pathway. And this ultimately will lead to the C influences. Now, the C influence is basically when one is able to attract divine knowledge and divine insight and divine direct spiritual experience. Now, according to Mouravieff, this C influence comes about by men and women that are more advanced on this path than you. But what I would say, what's happened for me directly, is these men and women of influence have appeared through writing, through my searching, through understanding this sort of spiritual process, moving from the world to the divine. I'm led to books, and there's just this synchronicity as I'm searching the heart, the book comes out. But I would also say that this synchronicity often, there's another type of synchronicity, which is one that perpetuates emotional or spiritual delusion. So one has to, actually I'm going to get to that point in 1 second. So basically all of this can ultimately lead to one's awakening from the matrix. It's also called initiation, and it's essentially overcoming the world. It's true emotional, spiritual liberation. And this path, I would say, from personal experience, is definitely not an easy path, but each step you take towards the BC influences, you also get help, which is a really encouraging thing. And basically what occurs is your Legion self and your lack of real will emerges into a divine self with a genuine will, and basically the divine and yourself become connected or fused, in which you have a solid divine I. This is emergent, and it's a unique expression of the divine connecting through your unique essence. Okay, so here's my addition of Mouravieff's teaching, and that is the D-influences. I just touched on it, but a D-influence is essentially a trickster influence. In other words, it mimics C, and this D-influence tends to work best for someone who hasn't balanced their emotional center. In other words, it will claim all of the C influences, but essentially will be a trickster influence. It can also involve a collapse, but this collapse of the D influences leads to a new foundation, but it's still a faulty foundation. Essentially, the D influence is what's found in a lot of New Age spirituality, in organized religion. I mean, I was a Christian for 6 years, and essentially I had the collapse and I had the savior experience, but looking back and seeing how undeveloped I was and how ignorant, how low my level of consciousness was, even though I would argue with you at the time that it wasn't, that defines a D influence, in that it's appearing like a divine influence, but it's in fact a trickster influence. And as I mentioned, this influence normally comes about by an undeveloped or warped self, which often has to do with blocked emotional centers. And as I said, I think all emotional blockage and distortion will lead to pretty much all of the spiritual distortions that we see in our world today. And what I'm suggesting is that, and this is really important to consider, that there is a force or an influence that will set up your collapse and then will shapeshift into another character, smiling, there to lift you back up, but on a de-influenced, faulty foundation. So the C influence is the one to aim for. It's about awakening the divine within. It doesn't involve any form of worship, which is important to remember. And this awakened man, after much effort, is a true man with a true will, a warrior man or woman, and a unique expression of the one divine. Okay, and just check out the Gnosis books by Mouravieff. I think they could be very helpful if any of this information is helpful. Okay.